The rain had been falling since before dawn, and by the time the new man came in from the yard, the whole of the servants' hall had already decided what he was. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen at Renholt, with water running off the shoulders of a plain brown coat, mud to the knee of his boots, a horse's lead still looped over one raw-knuckled hand, and he did not speak. The cook looked at him and looked away. The underfootman smirked into his cup. To the household gathered at the long deal table that gray October morning, he was the stable-master, and nothing more. A hired back and a pair of hands, a man who smelled of wet leather and animal and would sleep above the horses where such men slept. Only Hetty Marsh, standing at the hearth with a scuttle of coal in her arms, met his eyes and did not lower her own. She did not know yet that she was the only one in the house who would ever look at him and see a man rather than a place in the order of things. She only knew that he was cold, and that no one had thought to offer him so much as a chair. "You will want to dry those," she said, nodding at his boots, and set the scuttle down, and pulled the second stool out from beneath the table with the toe of her shoe. It was not deference. It was not the ducking, bobbing courtesy. The others gave to anyone a rung above them, and withheld from anyone a rung below. It was only the plain civility. A person owes another person who has come in wet from the rain. He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes, and was gone. And he sat. His name, they were told, was Mr. Colton. He had come with a letter from a stud farm in the north, and Mrs. Ainsley. The housekeeper had read the letter aloud, in her cool, precise voice, and pronounced him suitable, and that had been the end of the matter. What the letter did not say, what no letter said, was that the man who signed himself Colton was in truth Julian Hartwell, 7th Marquess of Ravensmoor, and that Renholt and every acre of its sodden park and every stick of furniture in its great shrouded rooms belonged to him, and had belonged to his brother before him, and that he had come home in another man's coat, because he could not yet bear to come home in his own. That is running ahead of the story, though. Stay with me a moment, because what happened at Renholt that autumn is worth the telling, and it begins not with the Marquess but with the housemaid, and with the particular way she had of refusing to make herself smaller than she was. Hetty was 23 years old, and she had been in service since the age of 11, and she had learned in that time the one lesson service is designed to teach, which is that a poor woman's dignity is a thing she keeps in secret, or not at all. She kept hers. She rose at 5 and blacked the grates, and carried the coal, and drew the water, and turned the mattresses, and she did all of it, with her chin level and her back straight, and this straightness of hers was the single thing about her that the upper servants could not forgive. The order of a great house runs on bowing. It runs on the scullery girl making herself nothing to the housemaid, and the housemaid to the parlor maid, and the parlor maid to the lady's maid, and all of them to the housekeeper, and the whole house together bowing itself flat when the family is in residence. Hetty did the work. She would not do the bowing. To Mrs. Ainsley, who had spent 30 years learning to bow gracefully, and to be bowed to, this was not humility withheld, it was insolence. "That Marsh girl, Mrs. Ainsley said to the cook in the still-room, on the second morning after the stable-master came, thinks a good deal too well of herself for a housemaid. You may mark me, pride like that always comes to grief." The cook agreed that it always did. Hetty heard none of this, and would not have altered, by a hair's breadth if she had. She had buried her mother at 14, and her father a wheelwright with clever hands and a weak chest, at 19, and she had learned across those two graves that the world would take everything from a person that the person permitted it to take, and would call the taking natural, and would expect to be thanked. She permitted the world her labor. She did not permit it the rest. And so, on the morning the new stable-master sat drying his boots at the kitchen hearth, and the underfootman muttered that some folk gave themselves airs above their station, meaning her Hetty, only poured the man a cup of the servant's tea, and set it at his elbow, and went about her work. The house itself was a wound with a roof over it. Renholt had been shut up for the better part of a year, the family gone, the shutters closed, the good rooms under Holland covers, and the reason was spoken of only in the lowest of voices. The old Marquess, they said, the sixth had died sudden in the spring, thrown from his horse on the frozen road, and his younger brother had inherited, and the younger brother had not once come to take up his own house. He was in London, some said. He was abroad, said others. He was mad with grief, said the boldest, and could not abide the sight of the place where his brother had been carried and dead. Whatever the truth of it, Renholt ran on a skeleton staff under Mrs. Wall. Ainsley, keeping the great empty rooms alive, against a master who never came, and the not coming had become the largest fact in the house. A silence everyone stepped around. What none of them knew was that the master had come. He had come in the second week of October, in a hired coat, with a forged letter and a false name, and he was sleeping above his own horses, and he was doing it because he could not walk into his brother's study, and sit in his brother's chair, and be called Your Grace, by servants who had loved the man he had failed to save. He had been there. That was the thing Julian could not put down. He had been riding beside Edmund on the frozen road that last morning, the two of them going out at first light against the groom's advice, and it had been Julian who laughed and put his horse to the gallop and dared his brother to follow, and Edmund had always followed. The ice took the gelding's legs at the turn by the bridge. Julian had heard the sound his brother made when he struck the road, and he had heard the silence after, and he had carried in his own arms into the house the weight of everything he had not been careful with. He had said none of this to a living soul. He had told the world he wished to see how his estate was truly run before he took it up, that a master learns more from the stable than the drawing-room, and the world had thought it an eccentricity and let him be. Only in the yard, with his hands in a horse's mane and the rain coming down, could he breathe at all. And into that held breath walked Hetty, who pulled out a stool for a cold man and would not bow. The first true conversation between them came at the end of that first week, in the tack-room, where Hetty had been sent with a basket of mending, because the stable-master, being new, had no woman to see, to his linen, and Mrs. Moy. Ainsley would not spare a proper maid for a groom. Hetty found him oiling a bridle by lamplight, his sleeves turned back, his hands moving over the leather, with a care that did not belong to any groom she had known. She set the basket down, and named what she saw before she had decided to. "You have gentlemen's hands," she said. He did not look up. "I have a groom's wages," he said, "which is what a man's hands are worth, and not what they look like." "That is a clever answer," Hetty said. "And it is not an answer at all." Now he looked up. The lamplight caught the gray of his eyes, which were the color of the sky over the park before snow, and there was in his face, for the length of a breath, the particular arrest of a man who has said a thing he practiced and heard it fail. "You are very forward," he said. "For a housemaid. I am very tired," Hetty said, "of watching this house decide what a person is by the state of his boots. You came in wet and cold, and no one gave you a chair. That is the sort of thing this house does. And it is wrong, and I will say it is wrong to a groom or to a lord. It makes no difference to me which." She picked up the bridle she had come to mend, or thought she had, and found her hands were not quite steady, and set it down. "I did not mean to speak so. Good night, Mr. Colton." She was at the door when he said low, "Thank you for the chair." She did not know why those 5 words stayed with her the whole of the walk back across the wet yard, or why she lay awake in the narrow room she shared with 2 other maids turning them over, or why the man's tired voice had reached some place in her the rest of the house had never come near. She told herself it was pity. A person may pity a stranger who has come cold into an unkind house. That is all it was. That is not all it was. And her body knew it before her mind would permit the knowing, which is the way of such things. He watched her. After that, though she did not catch him at it. He watched the way she spoke to the boot boy, whom everyone else cuffed and cursed, as though the child were a person with a name. He watched her carry a bowl of broth across the yard in the sleet to old Ned, the retired coachman, who lived out his last days in a room over the coach-house, and whom the family had forgotten and the servants found a nuisance, and he watched her sit with the old man an hour by his own account of the light in the window on her single half-day. When she might have slept, he had not asked her to do it. No one had. There was no one to see and no one to reward her, and she had done it anyway. And Julian, who had spent a year believing that kindness was a currency people spent only where it would be seen and repaid, stood in the door of the coach-house in the failing light, and felt something in his chest that he had thought the frozen road had killed for good. He said nothing to her of it. He said the next morning, "Only you sat with Ned. He is old and he is alone," Hetty said, "and no one else will." "Eat something," Julian said, for she had come out to the yard with no breakfast in her. He could see it in the gray of her face, and he took from his coat a heel of bread and an apple, and put them into her hands, and it was a command, and not an offer, and Hetty, who took nothing from anyone, found she had eaten the bread before she thought to refuse it. She read the command as coldness, a man ordering a servant about the audience. If there had been one, would have read the protection inside the order. There was no audience. There was only the yard, and the rain, and a bell ringing somewhere in the house. The bell was Mrs. Ainsley, and the news it carried changed the weather of the whole estate. The family was coming. Not the master, who still had not shown his face, but the master's aunt, the Dowager Marchioness of Ravensmore, who had appointed herself the guardian of the family's dignity, in the absence of a Marquess to guard it, and who was descending upon Renholt with her companion and her own servants and her granddaughter. It was universally understood to find her absent nephew and drag him back to his duty. By whatever means, a woman of iron will and £80,000 might command. The Dowager arrived in a black traveling carriage on a bright, cold afternoon, and she came into the great hall of Renholt like frost coming across a field. She was small and upright and dressed in the deep purples of half-mourning, and she had a way of holding her lorgnette that made the raising of it a verdict. Behind her came her granddaughter, Miss Arabella Vane, 19, and lovely and gowned in the palest blue, with a face composed into exactly the expression a young lady of fortune ought to wear, which is to say an expression that has never once had to ask itself what it truly felt. The servants lined the hall and bowed and curtsied as the dowager passed, a rippling bow like wind through barley. And Hetty curtsied too, because a curtsy in the hall to the family is the work, and not the bowing, and there is a difference, and Hetty knew the difference, even if no one else troubled to. The dowager's eye passed down the line of servants and stopped on her. "That one," the dowager said to Mrs. Beatty. Ainsley, not troubling to lower her voice, for one does not lower one's voice before furniture, curtsies as though she is doing me a favor. "I will not have sullen servants in this house. See to it, or turn her off." "She is a good worker, my lady," Mrs. Ainsley said, which was as near to a defense as 30 years of bowing had left her able to make. "But I have had occasion to speak to her of her manner. She thinks well of herself." "A housemaid," said the dowager, "has no business thinking of herself at all." And she went on up the great staircase, and the matter was closed, and Hetty stood in the hall, with her chin level and her cheeks burning, and her worth weighed and found wanting by a woman who had not asked her name. You have perhaps stood in such a line yourself, in some smaller way, and been measured by someone who did not trouble to see you. If Hetty's straight back has ever been yours, you already know what it cost her to keep it straight in that hall. Stay with her. The house had decided what she was. It was wrong, and it was not yet done being wrong, and the man who would prove it wrong was standing at that moment in the stable yard with his brother's house at his back, deciding at last to stop hiding from it. For Julian had watched the dowager's carriage come up the drive from the door of the stable, and he had known the black lacquer of it and the crest on the panel, and he had understood that his hiding was near its end. His aunt had come to find him. She would not find a Marquess sleeping above the horses. She would find a scandal, a family disgraced, a great name made ridiculous. He had a day, perhaps two, before some sharp-eyed servant of hers who had known him in London placed the stable-master's face. And still he stood in the yard, because to walk into the house was to become Ravensmore, and to become Ravensmore was to sit in the chair his brother would never sit in again. He did not sleep that night. Nor in the narrow room under the eaves did Hetty the Dowager's granddaughter met the stable master the following morning, and the meeting told Hetty more about both of them than a month of watching might have done. Miss Arabella Vane liked to ride, or liked to be seen to ride, and she came down to the stable in a habit of bottle green, with a feather in her hat, and found the new man in the yard. And she looked at him the way a certain kind of lady looks at a well-made servant, as at a horse she is deciding whether to purchase. Julian brought out the mare and held her, and Miss Vane, mounting, contrived to require a great deal of assistance, and laughed, and let her gloved hand rest a moment on the stable master's shoulder, and said, in a voice pitched to carry, "You are wasted in a stable. Whoever taught you your manners taught you above your place." And she rode off well pleased with herself, and did not see the stable master's face, which had closed like a shutter. Hetty saw it. Hetty was at the pump not 10 feet distant, and she saw the whole of it, and she saw that the man hated it, the false laugh, the proprietary hand, the pretty condescension of it, and she saw that he bore it because a groom must bear such things. And she felt for him a hot, unreasonable anger that was not pity. "She thinks you are a thing to be flattered," Hetty said when Miss Vane was gone before she had decided to speak. "She thinks I am a thing," Julian said. "The flattery is only her manners." "Does it not make you angry?" He looked at her then, full the shutter open for once, and said a thing he had not meant to say. "It makes me angrier to be flattered than to be scorned. Scorn, at least, tells the truth about what a person believes you are worth. Flattery is a lie told to your face by someone who wants a thing from you." He stopped. He had said too much. A groom does not speak so. "Forgive me," you asked. "I did ask," Hetty said quietly, and she did not curtsy, and she did not simper, and she looked at him as one person looks at another, who has just told the truth, and the yard was very still around them, and neither of them moved for the space of several breaths. And something passed between them, across that 10 feet of wet cobble that neither of them had a name for, and both of them felt. Then the boot boy came running with a message, and the moment closed, and Hetty carried her water into the house, with her heart going in a way she did not understand, and did not like, and could not stop. The days after that were a slow accumulation of small things, the way a snowfall is an accumulation of small things, until it has changed the shape of the world. She found reasons to cross the yard. He found reasons to be in it. He learned that she read that her wheelwright father had taught her letters and left her a Bible and a broken-spine volume of poems that she kept wrapped in a shawl at the bottom of her box, and that she read the poems on her half-day by the window until the light went. She learned that he knew horses the way a man knows a language he was born speaking, and that he was gentle with the frightened mare that the last groom had beaten, and that he never once raised his voice in the yard, and that the boot boy, who feared everyone, did not fear him. Neither of them said anything that a listener could have marked as courtship. There was no courtship. There could be no courtship between a housemaid and a groom, for even that small joining requires a cottage and a wage and a future, and neither of them had any of the three. There was only the yard, and the crossing of it, and the growing unbearable awareness each had of exactly where in it the other stood. The Dowager, meanwhile, hunted her nephew. She wrote letters to London. She questioned Mrs. Ainsley. She grew daily more certain that something at Wrenholt was being kept from her, and daily more inclined to blame the servants for the keeping. And her granddaughter, bored in a shut-up house in the country, amused herself with the stable-master, and did not trouble to hide the amusement, and it was Miss Vane's careless tongue that lit the fire. It happened at dinner, above stairs, though the whole of the servants' hall had it within the hour. The way a house always has such things. Miss Vane, at the dowager's table laughing over the wine, had described the new stable-master to her grandmother, his fine hands, his fine speech, the great joke of a man so clearly born above his place brought so low. And the dowager had set down her glass, and the dowager had said in the cold, flat voice that Hetty would hear reported and would recognize for what it was, fine hands and fine speech and no history anyone can name, sleeping above my nephew's horses in my nephew's empty house. That is not a groom. That is a swindler, or worse. I will have him turned off tomorrow and the magistrate sent for. If he gives the smallest trouble, the word went round the servants' hall like cold water. The stable master was to be turned off. The dowager had named him a swindler. And Hetty, hearing it at the long deal table where she had first set out a stool for him, felt the injustice of it rise in her until she could not sit still under it. She knew the man was no swindler. She knew it the way she knew her own name, and she knew that a word from the dowager would put him on the road with no character and no wage in the cold before winter, and that no one in the house would speak for him, because speaking for a groom cost more than any of them would pay. She went out to the yard that night against every rule of the house, in the dark, in the cold, with a lantern shuttered against being seen. And she found him in the tack room where the lamp still burned, and she told him. She told him plainly and quickly what the dowager had said and what was coming, and she watched the news land in his still face, and then she said the thing she had come to say. "You must go tonight," Hetty said. "Before they can send for the magistrate, I do not care what you have done or not done. I know you are no swindler. Whatever else you are that much. They will ruin you to be right, and they will enjoy the being right. And I could not sit at that table and let it happen without warning you. So, there, I have warned you. Go." For a long moment, Julian said nothing at all. He looked at this housemaid who had walked out into the cold night at the risk of her own place to warn a man she believed to be a penniless groom, who wanted nothing from him and had nothing to gain and had come anyway. And he felt the last of the frozen road break up and go out of him like ice off a river in the thaw. He had come to Renholt certain that no one saw a person truly, that the world weighed the coat and never the man. And here was a woman who had seen the man through the coat from the first wet morning, and who was trying now to save the groom she thought he was, and who had no notion at all that in saving the groom she was defending a Marquess in his own house. "Hetty," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. It came out of him like something taken from a locked place. "Sit down. I am not going anywhere, and neither, for a moment, are you, because there is a thing you must be told, and I will not have you hear it from anyone but me." He did not tell her, though. He could not there. Not with a lantern between them and the cold coming under the door and her face so open and so alarmed. He could not say, "I am." The Marquess, and watch the openness close, watch her rearrange him in her mind from a man into a rank, watch the one honest thing in the whole grey house turn into another servant bowing. He was a coward about it, and he knew he was a coward about it, and he let the moment pass and said instead only, "Trust me until tomorrow. Whatever happens tomorrow, do not be afraid, and do not, whatever you see, curtsy to me. Promise me that." "That is a very strange thing to ask," Hetty said. "Promise me." "I do not curtsy to grooms," she said with the ghost of her dry humor, and it nearly broke him. "I shall have no difficulty keeping that promise." She went back across the yard, and he stood in the door of the tack room and watched her lantern bob away through the dark, and he made his decision. At last, a year too late, and only just in time. He would end the hiding in the morning. He would do it in the one place where it would answer, before the one witness whose verdict he could no longer bear to leave standing. The dark moment came before the morning did, as such things do. The dowager did not wait. She had decided to be rid of the stable master, and she was not a woman who let a decision cool. And at first light, she sent her own man down to the stable with 2 of the grooms to put the swindler off the property, and she came down herself, in her purple half-mourning with her lorgnette, to see it done, and Miss Vane came with her to watch. Ainsley came because she was bid, and the servants gathered at the edges of the yard the way servants gather at the edge of anything that is happening to one of their own. And Hetty came. Hetty pushed to the front of them and stood in the cold morning with her heart in her throat, and when the dowager's man laid a hand on the stable-master's arm to march him off, Hetty stepped out of the crowd and into the open yard and said, in a clear voice that carried across the whole assembly, "He has done nothing. You are turning off an honest man on the word of a lady who never spoke to him. It is wrong, and someone in this yard ought to say so, and no one else will, so I will." The silence that followed was the deepest Renholt had known in a year. The dowager turned her lorgnette upon the housemaid who had dared to speak in her presence, and her voice, when it came, was frost over stone. "You?" she said, "the sullen one, of course. You will be turned off with him, and you will both be off my nephew's land within the hour. And you will neither of you have a character from this house. That is what comes of a servant who forgets what she is." "I have never once forgotten what I am," Hetty said. "I am a person. It is you who cannot see it." Miss Vane made a small sound of scandalized delight. Mrs. Ainsley went white, and the dowager drew breath to pronounce the sentence that would put a good woman on the winter road for the crime of telling the truth in a cold yard. She did not finish it, for the stablemaster stepped forward out of the grip of the dowager's man, and he pulled off the plain brown coat that had been his hiding for a month and dropped it in the mud of the yard, and he stood in his shirt-sleeves in the cold morning light, with his head up, and when he spoke, his voice was not a groom's voice at all. It was level and it was quiet, and it carried the whole weight of a name. "Aunt Constance," said Julian Hartwell, 7th Marquess of Ravensmore, "you will not turn off my housemaid." 8 words. No more than that. He did not shout them, and he did not gild them. He set them down in the silence the way a man sets down a thing that cannot be lifted again, and they landed on that yard like the first stone of an avalanche, and everything the words touched began to move. The dowager's lorgnette came down. Her face, which had never in Hetty's sight worn any expression but certainty, went through in the space of a breath the whole distance from disbelief to recognition to a stricken, dawning horror. For she knew her nephew's face. She had known it since he was a boy, and she saw now what a month of a groom's coat and a groom's dirt had kept her from seeing. And she understood in one falling instant that she had called the Marquess of Ravensmore a swindler at his own table, and had come down to his own yard to put him off his own land, and had done it all in front of the servants. "Julian," she said, and the name came out of her cracked in the middle. "Julian! What? What is this?" "Hi. This is my house," Julian said, "which you have kept for me faithfully, and for which I thank you. And this is my yard, and this woman is the only soul in it who has treated me as a man, and not as a coat. And I will not have her turned off. I will not have her spoken to again, as you have spoken to her. Do you understand me, Aunt?" The servants at the edge of the yard had begun one by one to sink into their bows and curtsies, the reflex of a lifetime bending them at the sight of the master unmasked, a whole household folding down into the order of things. And Hetty stood in the middle of them, alone, upright, not bowing, because he had asked her not to, and because she could not have moved if she had wished to. She was looking at the man she had drawn a stool for, and mended linen for, and warned in the night, and defended in the morning. And she was watching him become someone else entirely, watching the groom she had let herself feel, for turned before her eyes into the highest man for 40 miles. And she understood in the same falling instant the dowager understood it, that she had told the Marquess of Ravensmore that he could not see a person, and that she had refused, over and over, to bow to a lord. She did not know whether to laugh, or to weep, or to run. She did none of the three. She stood, and she kept her chin level because it was the only thing she had ever had, and she would not surrender it now, not even to this. Julian crossed the yard to her. He crossed it slowly, through the bending servants in his shirt-sleeves in the cold, and he stopped before her, and he did not tower, and he did not command. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across 10 feet of wet cobble on the morning she asked him if the flattery made him angry, and he said low, so that it was nearly for her alone, though the whole yard strained to hear it, "You promised you would not curtsy to me. I am glad to see you are a woman of your word. You let me warn you," Hetty said, and her voice was not steady, and she did not care. "You let me stand in the cold and tell you to run for your life. You are the Marquess. You were never in any danger at all." "I was in the gravest danger of my life," Julian said. "I had begun to believe no one would ever see me again. And then you set out a stool." The dowager behind him had sunk down onto the mounting block, all her iron gone out of her, an old woman who had been certainly and grievously wrong and knew it in front of everyone. She was not destroyed. No one destroyed her. Julian turned to her and gave her his hand and raised her up and said, only quietly, that she would take her breakfast in the morning room and they would speak, and that he did not doubt she had done what she believed was right, and this mercy, given where she had earned none, was a harder thing for the dowager to bear than any cruelty would have been. And she wept a little and was led away, and Miss Vane, who had flattered a Marquess to his face, believing him a servant and been seen doing it by that same Marquess, found suddenly that she had a great wish to return to London, and did so within the week, and troubled no one at Wrenholt again. All of that is the settling of things. The heart of it was in a yard, in the cold, with the whole house bent down around two people who would not bend to each other. "I have to tell you the rest," Julian said to her, later, when the yard had cleared, walking with her in the wild autumn garden where no one could overhear, and he told her the rest. He told her about the frozen road and the dare and the sound his brother made and the year he had spent unable to enter his own house, and the coat he had put on, because a groom is allowed to grieve where a Marquess is only allowed to inherit. He told her that he had watched her carry broth to old Ned and read poems by a window and speak to a boot boy as though the child were a person, and that she had shown him, without knowing she did it, that kindness given where no one sees and no one repays is the only kind that is real, and that he had wanted, for the first time since the ice took his brother, to be a man worth such kindness. He did not make her a speech. He said these things plainly, in a low voice, looking at the wet grass more than at her, and Hetty listened, and understood at last the thing his coldness had been, which was grief wearing the only face it was permitted, and her anger at him went out of her entirely and did not come back. "I am a housemaid," she said when he had done. "You are the Marquess of Ravensmoor. Whatever this is, it cannot be a thing that ends anywhere." "It can end," said Julian, "wherever I choose to have it end, for I am, as you have observed, the highest man for 40 miles, and there is very little anyone can do to me about it." And he almost smiled, and it was the first thing near to amusement she had seen in his grave face, and it undid her more thoroughly than any grand declaration could have done. "I am not asking you to be a marchioness this morning. I am asking you to walk in this garden with me tomorrow, and the day after, and to go on telling me the truth, which no one else in my life has ever once done. The rest we may leave to sort itself out. It has a way of sorting itself out when a man stops running from it." Hetty looked at him a long moment in the cold, bright garden. Then she reached out, and she took the edge of his shirt-sleeve between her fingers, for he was still in his shirt-sleeves, and had not thought of it, and she said, "You will catch your death out here with no coat. Come inside." And it was a command, and not an offer. The same command he had given her over a heel of bread, and he heard the protection inside it. And he understood that she had, in her own way, said yes. They did not marry that winter. The season of mourning was not yet done, and Hetty would not be married in haste, as though there were something to hide. And Julian, who had learned patience the hard way, did not press her. She stopped being a housemaid. She did not become all at once a lady. She spent the winter learning the running of the great house for Mrs. Ainsley, who found to her own considerable astonishment that she did not mind teaching the sullen girl, for the sullen girl had never once, in all that time, bowed and scraped, and there was a strange relief. Mrs. Ainsley discovered, in the company of a person who would not. By the following spring, the banns were read in the small stone church at the edge of the park, and there was no great crowd to witness it, only the household. And old Ned brought down from his room over the coach-house in a wheeled chair, to see it wrapped in a rug against the cold, because Hetty would not be married without him there. And when it was done, and they came out of the church into the pale spring light, Julian took from the inner pocket of his coat, his own coat now, well made and dark and fitting him as a Marquess's coat should, a small worn thing that he put into her hand. It was the broken-spined volume of poems her father had left her. She had thought it lost in the upheaval of the autumn. He had found it, and mended the spine himself with a strip of leather from the tack room, working at it by lamplight over many evenings with the same careful gentleman's hands she had named in the tack room. On the first true night they spoke, and he had kept it for her, kept it safe through the whole long winter. Hetty Marsh, who was now the Marchioness of Ravensmore and would spend the rest of her life being the only person at Wrenholt who told its master the truth, held the mended book in her 2 hands in the spring light, and could not for a moment speak at all. She had kept her dignity in secret her whole life because the world had never given her a place to keep it in the open. She had a place now. The man beside her had built it for her out of nothing but the plain fact of having once been given a stool. She opened the book. Her father's hand was still in the margin where he had marked his favorite lines. She did not read them aloud. She only stood a while in the churchyard with her husband beside her, and old Ned smiling in his chair, and the spring coming up green through the winter grass. And she held the book against her, and she did not bow her head. If Hetty's straight back has stayed with you the way it stayed with the man who married her, you might tell someone else her story so that it goes on being told. The house had decided what she was, on a wet, gray morning, before she had said a word. It was wrong. In the end, so gently that it hardly knew it had happened, the whole house came round to her.